China, the United States and other Pacific countries gather in Hawaii for the largest maritime military exercises in the world. Hello, I'm Anand Naidu and this is The Heat. For only the second time ever, China has sent a fleet of 5 ships to the rim of the Pacific maritime exercises in Hawaii. That's the largest naval military exercises in the world. The war games are designed to improve combat coordination and military cooperation among more than 25 countries. We begin with this report from CCTV's Nathan King in Hawaii.
As you come to us, the Chinese supply ship, the Gaoyou, heading out to sea for its part of the exercises here at RIMPAC 2016, one of 5 Chinese vessels involved. Here on the ground, it's calm waters after the arbitration result. Things are continuing as normal. 26 nations cooperating in the biggest naval exercise in the world. But there are questions. As these navies cooperate, what will happen at the end of these exercises when they go back to their national navy to follow orders, of course? Will there be heightened tensions because of the result? Considering also that a lot of the rulings suggest that there is no 200-mile exclusive economic zone or continental shelf because their rocks only 12 nautical miles, it means that the Pacific navies might be coming closer together. Because the US supports its ally, the Philippines, does that mean that the US will conduct more so-called freedom of navigation patrols? How will China respond? What will other claimants in the areas, not just in the Nansha Islands, but the Shisha Island chain like Vietnam happen as well? All these questions remain unanswered, but a lot of people are saying that the cooperation at exercises like this, a US-hosted RIMPAC, but others also hosted by China and other navies, are becoming more important because of the arbitration result. More training needs to be conducted with navies of the Asia-Pacific so that they can work together on the high seas, avoid misunderstandings close to shore as well, and better establish communications to avoid misunderstandings or the escalation of tensions. The Gaoyou supply ship, very much part of these peaceful, integrated exercises, which should be the way forward for the Pacific navies of the 21st century. But following this ruling result from The Hague, the big question is, will tensions rise here? Nathan King, CCTV, Pearl Harbor, Hawaii.
Joining me now from Beijing, Yang Xiao is a senior fellow at the China Institute of International Studies and executive vice president at the Institute for Boe Forum for Asia. With me in the studio is Douglas Powell. He is vice president for studies at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and an expert on U.S. relations with Asian nations. Thanks to both of you for joining us. Yang Xiao, let me start with you. These RIMPAC exercises are a priority for China. This is the second time it's taking part. Why is it so important for China to be there?
Well, 2 points reflect China's way of thinking about RIMPAC. Firstly, U.S.-China male-to-male relationship is the most bilateral military relationship for PLA. So RIMPAC is a very important platform for the cooperation and the coordination with U.S. navies, although right now we have a very sharp and sensitive differences. But in general, Chinese policymakers really want to make a sort of balance. On one hand, try to control the differences. On the other hand, want to strengthen the cooperation and exchanges with U.S. counterparts. And secondly, the RIMPAC is really newly emerged thing for Chinese military forces. China highly value this chance to have exchanges not only with the United States but also with the many other national navies. Based on the 2 points of consideration, China sent well-trained and highly disciplined ships to join in this RIMPAC.
Douglas, in the United States, there is a feeling that there is a significant significant gap, real or perceived, in the military-to-military relationship between the United States and China. So to what extent do exercises like RIMPAC close that gap?
Well, I think the perception of a gap is a product of decades where we have been interested in better relations with the military of China, but they weren't interested in us, and vice versa. We went back and forth with these cycles until 2012 with the arrival of new President Xi Jinping as military commander as well as party chairman. And he has overseen a much more intense bilateral interaction with the United States that has gone through thick and thin when we've had difficulties. Nonetheless, Chinese military leaders have stuck by the need to keep in dialogue and in contact. And RIMPAC is sort of the high point of that, although given that China's Navy is growing and its scope of interest is expanding, we're going to be interacting more and more, not just at RIMPAC, but South China Sea, East China Sea, Indian Ocean, and elsewhere.
Yang Qiu, one of the purposes of this exercise is for each country to share its strengths with other nations. So in that respect, what does China bring to the exercise?
Well, to my observation, Chinese Navy try to make achievements and progresses through this RIMPAC participation by two areas. Number one, build up mutual trust or reduce mutual suspicions with U.S. Navy. And number two, Chinese Navy as a growing power really want to learn something from the other counterparts, from the U.S., from the other navies, especially in the area of the non-traditional security cooperation like cracking down transnational criminal activities on maritime or multinational efforts on rescue and so on. So in short, we want to learn something from the RIMPAC, and we want to train our Navy through the RIMPAC, and we want to strengthen our ties with U.S. Navy from the RIMPAC.
Douglas, on that point of learning something from other nations, the other side of that question I just asked there to our guest in China is, what does China hope to take away from these exercises?
Well, you know, China sank its navy in the 15th century and really has not had much of a navy until very recently. And so unlike most nations that are maritime in nature, the navies are out all the time interacting, learning, becoming the most international of forces for England, France, Germany, you name it. Now China's joining that group, and China's coming late, and they have a lot to catch up with. Right now, China's military leader of the Navy, Wusheng Li, is a particularly effective commander who's reached out to grab every bit of learning he can. They've used opportunities such as the patrols in the waters off Somalia, where China's trying to protect its own commercial shipping. And they've learned to cooperate without being integrated into the NATO forces that are also there to protect other shipping.
And presumably, the growth of the Chinese Navy is driven in large part by the fact that it's now one of the major economic powers in the world.
Exactly. They've got broad interests, and they're getting wider.
Yang Qiu, RIMPAC Asia-Pacific security, which countries, in your view, pose the greatest threat to that security in this region of the world?
Basically, in my view, we have two categories of challenges or threats facing by all nations, including the United States. One category threats is the non-traditional, say, from transnational criminal to terrorism. But the other category of threats from the zero-sum game strategy competition, say in Asia Pacific, there are basically two groups of nations. One group of countries are member of a collective security system, and the other rest are non-member of a collective security architecture. So the problem is, each country are trying to make efforts to strengthen their own security, but because all countries are divided into two groups, whenever the member of selective security countries strengthen their security, then the non-member will feel insecure, more insecure than before, and they will make a reaction that will trigger a more unsecure sense by the other party. So in such negative interactions, and many countries feels the other as a potential threat, like China think U.S. and Japan as a potential threat, and vice versa. Especially on the Korean Peninsula, both North and South regard the other party as the most dangerous threat, especially backed by the South Korea threats, North Korea backed by the U.S. that regarded by North Korea as the highest threat. So in short, the negative security competition put all nations and all countries in the region in a zero-sum game. That's the dilemma for all of the countries.
Right, we want to talk about South Korea in the next part of our show, but Douglas, let me ask you this. There has been a heightening of tensions between the United States and China in the wake of this arbitration result announced earlier this week. How important is an exercise like RIMPAC in not just building confidence, but also in bringing tensions down, of creating greater communication between the two sides?
Well, I wouldn't draw too much of an association between the events coming out of The Hague and this activity with RIMPAC. RIMPAC will be a means whereby we better manage those tensions that arise elsewhere. Right. And the security dilemma, which Yang Xiyu was just talking about, is very active and dynamic in the South China Sea, and we need really be careful to manage it well. It's look at the Korean Peninsula, where there's an incipient security dilemma. We have a latent security dilemma in the cross-strait Taiwan mainland relationship as well, and that could heat up at any time. So we've got a lot to manage, and learning to have our militaries operate with each other, whatever the theater, is going to make it safer, less prone to incidents. The underlying mistrust between China and the United States has been growing, not diminishing. And those kinds of mistrust can easily lead you into incidents that are very hard to manage and that become driven by popular opinion. So getting professionals involved to avoid those incidents is really critical.
Yang Xiu, there are elements in the U.S. Congress here who have called for China to be disinvited from taking part in RIMPAC, given those tensions that we've just been talking about over the South China Sea. Would that be a mistake?
Well, China regards some voices, negative voices from Capitol Hill, as a very too elegant attitude towards China. I think China believes participation in the RIMPAC by China is a benefit for China. But meanwhile, China's participation equally contribute to RIMPAC. So that's not a relationship between give and take. That's not China take from the U.S. That's not a thing U.S. gave something to China. So such voices say China shouldn't be invited to the RIMPAC. China don't regard such voices as objective and the right things. If U.S. really takes such an attitude, American government really takes such an attitude, China will say, fine, we won't take part in the RIMPAC. That doesn't matter. That cannot impede our construction of our Navy.
Okay, we're going to have to take a break right now. Coming up, the U.S. is deploying a missile defense system to South Korea. Why do China and Russia think it's a bad idea? Stay with us, you're watching The Heat.
We demanded that the United States should not seek its own security at the expense of others, let alone harming the legitimate security and interests of other countries under the excuse of security threat.
The Chinese Foreign Minister there, Wang Yi, expressing China's concerns over the deployment of the THAAD missile defense system in South Korea. Welcome back. China is calling on the U.S. to halt plans to bring a major missile defense system to the Korean Peninsula. An advanced missile system, commonly called THAAD, is heading to South Korea to counter threats from the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. Neighboring China opposes the system because the advanced missile defense can reach into its territory. Russia is also opposed to the deployment of the system. Well, joining our panel now for this part of the program, Dmitry Babich is a Russian journalist with Sputnik International and a political analyst. Still with us from Beijing, Yong Qiu is a senior fellow at the China Institute of International Studies, and Douglas Powell is vice president of studies for the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Let's go to Dmitry. Dmitry, what are Russia's specific concerns over the deployment of THAAD in South Korea?
Well, I think it's not just Russia's concern. When the Chinese Minister of Foreign Affairs, Wang Yi, visited Moscow several months ago, he and his Russian colleague, Sergei Lavrov, saw eye to eye on the problem of the THAAD's deployment in South Korea. I mean, if you look at the Russian territory, you have now 3 areas where the United States is placing its so-called anti-ballistic missile system right next to the Russian border. There is one in Romania and Poland, there is another on Alaska, and now there's going to be a third one next to our far eastern border in South Korea. Of course, Russia is concerned. You know, all the words about the defensive nature of these systems are simply ludicrous, because every person with the beginnings of military knowledge knows that the most painful strikes are made from behind the so-called shields, in this case missile shields. So Russia is concerned because you see a very clear strategy here. You see the United States using their allies to deploy arms and so-called shields around the Russian territory. In Poland, where you have a very radical defense minister, Antoni Macierewicz, he did not hide it. Just yesterday he said that he was, I hope, very happy that NATO, with all of its gigantic might, is turning against Russia. End of quote. Mr. Macierewicz was not scolded by the United States for making that statement, so it's quite clear that we have the same pattern here. We have anti-Russian military groups forming themselves in Eastern Europe, on Alaska, and now we have a powerful military group with anti-missile system in South Korea.
Yong Qiu, what are the major Chinese concerns over the deployment of the system, beyond the fact that, of course, it can cover large parts of China as well?
Well, basically 2 points about the concerns. Number one, you mentioned cover large part of the Chinese territory. Basically, 1/3 of the scope of the X-band radar can monitor roughly 1/3 of Chinese total territory, while the so-called North Korea threats that occupies only a very small part, roughly the size of North Korea, is similar with the state of Virginia. So targeting at a small state like North Korea size with Virginia, use the X-band radar, the true intention is not at North Korea, but at Russia and China. And secondly, it's more important, the China concerns the following up, say the introduction of a THAAD into South Korea will be the very important step that will be followed by the expanding THAAD systems in Northeast Asia. We know U.S. has built up an anti-missile system as a wall in Europe. And now U.S. want to build up another wall in the Asia Pacific. U.S. finally will build up a global NMD into the GMD, Global Missile Defense. So that is the strategic reason concerned by China. Such a strategic consideration of the United States by THAAD and the expanding of THAAD will destabilize the strategic situation in this region. That's why China can strongly oppose that.
Douglas, as we can hear deep suspicion on the part of both China and Russia on the deployment of THAAD, to what extent does this upset the strategic balance in that part of the world?
Well, we're a long way from upsetting the strategic balance in Northeast Asia or East Asia generally. But as I started to say in their first segment today, there's an incipient security dilemma. The democratic leader of South Korea and the democratic president of the United States must take measures to protect their people if we have the technology and capability people from rogue sources of missile threat. North Korea has been exponentially increasing its missile development, and the threat is growing rapidly. And so the U.S. and Korean presidents have agreed that they'll deploy THAAD in order to provide some protection for their populations against these missile threats. Now, China looks, and Russia joins China in looking at this, and they see what we think is purely defensive as purely offensive. And then they're probably going to take measures of their own, which they will view as purely defensive, and we will see as offensive. And so this is when leadership has to come in and try to exercise some control and moderation to prevent the endless escalation of security dilemma type dynamics. China made some tactical mistakes in this. They openly told the South Koreans not to do things, which in a society like South Korea means that South Koreans have no choice but to show they're not going to be dictated to by China.
Right, but are these concerns that are being expressed by China and Russia valid concerns? Because as Dmitry just pointed out, if you look at the way anti-missile systems have been deployed around Russia, I mean, this is a third frontier.
Well, I think there are 3 points to make. One, missiles involved in actually defending against the small threat from North Korea, right, or from Iran in the case of Romania and Poland, are very small. And so the number of deployed interceptors will be very small, not a threat to major powers' nuclear arsenals. Secondly, China is concerned about the ability of radars to look into China, and some experts say that the Chinese are afraid the U.S. will be able to dissect what is a Chinese real missile warhead and what is a decoy, and that will give us an advantage in a standoff conflict with nuclear arms, which is hopefully not in the cards. And the third, and I think the most real concern on China's part that I can detect, is that we will integrate Korea, Japan, and China fears Taiwan somehow into an advanced anti-missile detection and launch system in Northeast Asia. And that would create a kind of serious political threat of dividing Northeast Asia, but also a military threat to China in the longer run. We've tried to have discussions on this at a technical level, but China has refused those discussions, saying this is a strategic matter and should be handled by the top leadership. But I think it'll be on the agenda for quite a long time.
Dmitry, it looks like the deployment is going ahead. How does Russia respond to it?
Well, it's up to the military people to decide what would be the appropriate response. But I just think that this is very sad what's going on. We don't need this confrontation at all, and if anyone is to blame for it, that is certainly not Russia. I mean, don't get me wrong, the Russian leadership has no illusions about North Korea. We have had very difficult relationship even in the Soviet times, because North Korea basically supported the Maoists in China. So for many years, relations were frozen. We joined the sanctions against North Korea. Together with China, Russia is making every effort to demilitarize the North Korean regime. But that doesn't mean that so-called democratic nations will be allowed to achieve complete military superiority to the point when they can attack other nations which they consider non-democratic with impunity. And that seems to be the plan of the United States and their allies, both in Eastern Europe and in Southeast Asia. If we look at the bigger picture, if we look at the 100% support of the United States for the ruling of the Hague Tribunal on the South China Sea, which is very controversial, and in which the United States could play a role of an intermediary and not of a party to the conflict, all of these signals, they show that the United States want to, they want to oppose Russia and China head-on on all fronts, obviously relying on smaller nations around Russia and China. And in this situation, the United States and the whole world very often become or will become hostages to the ambitions of local nationalist leaders. Right now, the Polish nationalist politicians who are directly accused of being undemocratic and even insane by the European Union and various international organizations. These Polish politicians, when they feel behind themselves the United States, they make all kinds of irresponsible statements about Russia. I will be terrified if the same story repeats itself with South Korea, Japan, and China. You know, if Japan feels reassured by the United States and it starts to irritate China, that may lead to some very dangerous developments.
Okay. Yang Xiu, how does China respond to this? I mean, could we see China engage in some kind of arms race here to counter the threat? Could this push China's nuclear modernization program further up its list of priorities?
Briefly, China will try to make some strategic rebalancing to balance suddenly emerged threats by SAD by multiple options, either to strengthen our missile attacking capabilities, or build up our anti-missile system, or develop new technologies like supersonic and drones and so on. So in short, China will make all efforts to make a rebalance caused by the SAD and anti-missile system around our neighboring area.
Okay, that's where we have to leave it. Thanks to all of you for joining us. And that's all we have time for, but the conversation continues online. Chat with us about this or any other topic on Twitter. We at CCTV_America. We also use Facebook. Find us at facebook.com/CCTV America. I'm Arun Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for being with us.